Hello everybody, welcome back. Today my tutorial is kind of built upon my previous things, and I'm a little bit surprised I haven't done this yet. What I'm going to be showing you is Linework styles. Specifically like just different styles and how they affect a drawing. And simply how you put your lines down can be incredibly unique to you, but it can also be kind of an homage to other styles and can make people immediately associate this with a certain style or a certain way of drawing. So what I'm going to be showing you is not one, but 4 different styles. Also, for those who want it, that is the underdrawing that I've done. I'm always true to my previous tutorials, so that's there. Specifically, we're going to be showing. Now, these are only 4 different styles that I know enough and I'm comfortable enough with sharing. Obviously, there's 1.5 million different styles out there. You can research your favorite artists and kind of see how they do it. But in my opinion, a good linework style can hold up on its own. You don't need color, you don't need shading if the lines are good enough to support the rest. So I'm going to be showing you a uniform linework style where they're all the same size roughly. One with super thin lines, one that's more of a comic book style, that's a good mix between the two, and thin lines with kind of an expressive flair thrown into it just to help add that little bit. So, now, before I jump into this, I want to note, this one is not going to be strictly a digital tutorial. I know that I've been doing a lot of strictly digital stuff in the past, but through this I'm actually going to explain tools and styles you can use in order to make these same effects in your traditional media. So I'll go through and I'll explain what tools you can use to make these and how you can go about making them yourself. So let's jump in. Okay, so this first one we're going to look at is the uniform line style. Now I'm only going to go over these roughly and then I'll finish them all in later so you can see how different they all are. But what the uniform line style means is, and I'll lower this opacity a little bit, and notice I did these super thick lines on purpose for the sketch just to kind of give me a little bit more leeway with these different line styles, since they all kind of structure the face differently. So with this one, you want to have assume a digital program right now. You want to have a little bit larger than what you're normally used to, and then you actually bring up your minimum size. Not very much, but just enough so that you don't get those little tiny spikes at the end. You want it to kind of get about that large. And the way you go about doing that is you up the minimum size to between 10 and 15. Any larger than that and it gets a little bit uncontrollable and you'll have to go through and clean up the line work, which you really should do anyways because clean line work is a really good thing to have. But still, this can kind of shave off some time there and make your life a little bit easier. Now, for traditional media, what you do for this is like a ballpoint pen. That or a micron pen might work as well, one of those felt tip inking pens, because those like to keep a very specific size and then a little bit larger, a little bit smaller based on your pressure. But they really don't like doing those other sizes, they like to stick to something in particular. Now this one is a very generic size. Now notice I don't have much in the way of those points. But this is kind of like a first line work style that you're going to be using. Now, what it does for you is it takes a little bit of the thought out of the drawing, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I mean, in fact, this style can be used for pretty much anything for a long time. Like this is my default that I go to. I'll experiment with other things, with other ideas, but generally I'll like to keep this, especially if I'm doing something a little bit faster, because this doesn't require a whole lot of messing around for it to still look good. Now, keeping in mind certain things like line weight, so this area down here I made a little bit thicker, but really you want to keep things pretty uniform throughout. If that means going back over something and adding on to it, then so be it, you do that. Because in the end, the drawing itself should be what's mostly important. So right now I'm just kind of throwing in the jawline, but or the jaw itself, the jawline is back here. But this style is pretty much self-explanatory. You just keep in mind the limitations of what you have, so you can't make those really sharp points. So the hair might look a little bit flatter than normal, and these things back here might look a little bit weird, but you can still get those really nice curves that you want. You can still create all the effects you want, and you can go back over your lines a couple times and make them thicker to put emphasis on certain items and still get that really nice line weight that you want in certain illustrations. But really, that's pretty much how it goes. Other things to note with this is you can vary the actual size of it, but if you make it like 100%, you're getting these super thick lines. And while you can drop it quite a bit, it still makes it kind of unwieldy, because suddenly you have to line up perfectly with your last line, or else you get that weird spike to it. And you can't go back through and blend that in very well, because A, you'll still have the spike, and B, when you finally get rid of it, you'll either make another spike to it, or you'll cause just really large bulbous area in the line work. So with this one, it's a little bit precise, because if you have it too high of a percentage, you can get that kind of that same effect. And you can't quite get those points to it without having to go through and erase a bunch of things. But this style also kind of requires you to do some cleanup afterwards, unless you've had a lot of experience with it and you really know what you're doing. But it's perfectly fine to have to go through and clean up your line work. I mean, no one's going to expect you to be perfect. And to be totally honest, if you have to go through and clean up your line work, it means that you care about your drawings. So no shame in having to clean up stuff. And you can see me, I'm still constantly fiddling with this while I'm talking. There's no purpose in me doing that. There's so much more I have to add on to. But that's how you do the uniform line work style. So I'm going to leave this one be, and I'll finish that one up later, because I kind of don't want this video to last an hour. And there's not much I can really add on to there right now and still keep on talking. So let's jump over to the thin line style. Now, the thin line style is a little bit like the thick line style, but you do incredibly thin lines. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would I want to do this? And the reason for it is to make it look a little bit sketchy, a little bit more dynamic. Now, the way you do this with a more traditional style is a pencil. Like a mechanical pencil in particular would probably work better for this, because mechanical pencils can keep their sharp point much better. But with a thin line work style, you kind of just are going over things a lot. Now, you want these to be a little bit loose, a little bit more free-flowing, because that can add on to the effect. Now, if you're using a digital program for this, you just make the brush you're most used to really thin. Simple as that. And you can get these really nice looking things. Now, what's the purpose for this, you might ask? Well, there's a lot of purposes for this. You can either use it as kind of a stepping stool onto a later one, as I'll show later, or even just like a sketch, or for the underlining of your more final drawings. For people who've been watching this series for a while, you may remember earlier on, I actually was using really thin lines for all my sketch work, and then I switched over to these much more thicker, expressive ones. And this is pretty much calling back to how I used to do things. In fact, I still have the pen here if you guys want to copy it in Sci. But pretty much what it does is it just has a texture on top of it so that it still feels a little bit more like paper. But this one is actually completely fine with being on its own, purely because you can kind of get these a little bit more expressive lines. You can have little jaggies on items just so that you can put more emphasis on things you want people to look at. It's also a little bit faster to put down, and you don't have to put as much thought into it, purely because it's expected that it's not going to be perfect. And that's where this type of line work really shines. Because it's both not expected to be perfect and it's not going to be perfect, and if you try to make this perfect, then you are severely messing up and defeating the purpose of it. But because it has a little bit of artistic leeway to it, you can have some fun with it. Now this one does have a couple of issues, namely when it comes to coloring, you will have to be a little bit more careful as to where exactly your lines end. I mean, take this spot for example. like, do I color in all of this right up to the points? Do I kind of leave that open a little bit? It can lead to a little bit of confusion when it comes to how you color it, but you could fiddle with it and rework the lines just a little bit so that it still works, like, you know, completing that one or making certain areas thicker. What this thing is also good for is you can actually just not have any shading to it by like bringing up these areas down here. You can kind of create the idea of a shade. Now, I'm not going to be doing this here because I feel as though that would be a little bit extreme for just a Linework tutorial, but please note that that is an option. Other things you can do with this specific style or with this specific thing is you can use this as a stepping stool onto a lot of different media or a lot of different styles. Painterly styles is the first thing that comes to mind because you can very easily kind of wash this layer out and put on top of it your colors and and continue with your drawing with like that. But as a standalone, it's always going to feel rough, and it really should feel rough. While you can go back through and you can like refine these lines so that like there's no jaggies on it, you make things just one single tiny line going down and going back up. That is a possibility. You can very easily do that, and you can use that for the full drawing, just those like really thin tiny lines. And what's useful with doing that is you can actually get a lot more detail into your drawings because the tiny lines allow you to get that much more detail. And remember when I said that this style is a lot quicker? I do believe I finished this entire profile thing in the amount of time it took me to explain what you can do with this. But now I can go through and I can like refine things and I can make things feel a little bit more sketchy and a little bit more energized, like there's more going on here. Things like this and kind of bringing them back down. I mean, there's a lot of little tiny things I can just add into it, but I'm gonna leave that one be. There's nothing I can really do at the moment that would really help out. But I do want to point out, note how I made these areas up here like multiple lines thick, and yet for the hair I only did one line. The purpose for something like this is because the hair is a little bit less important than the face, so by doing this thicker you get a little bit more attention to the details in the face, and since it's a lot more rough, those details are a little bit obscured, and people's minds will kind of fill in the blanks just a little bit, just to make it feel a little bit more alive. So that's what you can do with that. So, jumping down, comic book style. Now this one is fun, because it's actually a mix of the other two styles. And well, what do you mean by that? Well, let me get started. Note how I'm still using the exact same pen I was using before. But as I go through and I'll do the line work for this, I might actually have to do a jump cut for this one. Yeah, I will have to do a jump cut for this one now I think about it. I'll give a bit of a warning, but first off, before I do that, I'll have to explain a little bit of the traditional media you can use for this. Now, the traditional media is two different things. You can use a micron, like two different versions of microns or two different pens that have a uniform size, one that's very thin and one that's very thick, to do this. Or you can do what I actually really love doing for this, and that's using a very thin tool. Again, inking tool is important here, so no pencils, sorry. But you can use a micron and then using a brush tip pen. Now, a brush tip pen is pretty much it's just like a normal pen, but instead of a pen tip, it has a brush tip, so that you can press very lightly and get really fine points, or you can press really hard and get really bold and expressive things. And that's really useful for this style. So I'm going to jump real quick just so that I can finish up the thin lines here. I'll be right back. Alright, and welcome back. So I put in the thin lines, and I purposely made these like very much not sketchy, so you can learn from that if you want and use this and refine these lines a little bit more and use that as your final drawing. Or you can do what I'm going to do here Now, I do this in a different layer because it lets me fiddle with it a little bit more. You really don't have to. You can do this on the same layer, it's perfectly fine. But I'm going to be bringing up a couple of ideas from the uniform lines one. It's still not done because I still have to do that shortcut. But not as much of, not as high on the percentage and not as high on the actual size of it. And of course, I am making it bigger. But you want to find the outside lines and just draw out the outside lines. Not going inwards whatsoever, although you can do a little bit of a flip like that if you really want to bring in that look. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just actually going to do the pure outsides. But you might be thinking to yourself, why on earth would I want to do these outside lines? But it's actually pretty reasonable because the inside lines are all the details. They're all the shapes of the body, the folds of the clothes, the look of the eyes, things like that. Little tiny details that you probably wouldn't be able to get as easily by doing the uniform line style. But by doing this really thick outline, it lets you still keep a lot of expression in the drawing. Expression that may be lost otherwise because you have to conform to this very, very thin thing. And with the thin lines, you may not be able, or you'd have to spend a lot more time trying to get those expressions back and still being able to keep the thin line style. So by doing this, you can really add into that. Also, the super thick lines will help differentiate the character from the background. What if the background has thick lines too? Well, it'll help incorporate them in. And if the background has thick lines, well then you could very easily place where the character is by where the lines are. If the item in the background is actually in front of the character in some spot, then that thing's outside lines will cover up your character's outside lines. This also lets you get really, really good line weights as well, because for one, these lines are super freaking heavy, so it puts a lot of emphasis on the character and on the character's silhouettes as well. So if you have a character with a very unique silhouette, which, as I may have said before, the silhouette is if the character is completely in black as though they're a shadow, and that's just the outline of the character, what you would see if the character was a complete shadow. And a character with a unique silhouette will stand out a lot more. So this will help bring out that silhouette. Although if you had a character with a super thick line surrounded by characters without the super thick line, you're gonna have an issue. But if the character has a unique silhouette, then that brings out that purpose then. I don't know why I could not say that correctly. But variations of this style, you could actually have these outlines be a different color. And all of this does work traditionally as well, by the way. If you go through this with a brush pen, for example, I absolutely love my brush pen, by the way. If you go through with a brush pen, you can actually switch out the ink with a different color ink and do things with that, so like a blue ink or a sepia tone ink. Digitally, obviously, you just put it down as a different color. But wow, I'm actually finished up with this one too. But it's actually a relatively quick style as well. Although, with this one, the time is eaten up by trying to keep the lines consistent. Now, things on the bottom you may want to have thicker lines for, and things of importance you want to have thicker lines for. But if you can also use this for perspective work as well, if something is, thank you brain, I cannot speak right now, but if something is further in the background, you would have it with much thinner lines, purely because that'll help push that item in the back. But if something is in the front, you'd have these really, really bold and thick lines. And I actually made these a little bit thin overall. Like, you could go through and make these dramatically thicker, just because that'll help bring out the style and make it feel a little bit more unique. There's some people that I know of that do like pretty much this just all around the character, and that looks awesome. Like, it's perfectly fine to do so. So in this one, when I come back later, I'll definitely bring out the line work a lot more. But let's jump over to the next one. Thin and expressive. So what does that mean, you may ask yourself? I don't know what that means. I can't help you. I'm sorry, everyone. Anyways, it's kind of that really thin lines that I'd shown before, though thicker this time. These ones are actually going to be as, maybe not as thick, but almost as thick as the lines I'd shown on the first one, though they don't have the minimum size down yet. So these are allowed to get those little tiny points on them. And that's important for this style. It's important because what we're going to be doing is, once we have all the line work done, and maybe not quite all the line work, I can show this without having to do all of it first, unlike the other styles. And suddenly I forgot how to do the tip of the nose. Grumble, grumble, grumble. But this one, all of its time is eaten up by the refining. And what's the refining stage, you may ask? Well, I can show you in a moment, but first off, the ways you can do this traditionally is you can actually do this with any media you really like for your line, so any inking tools, sketching, things like that. It's more so based on how it's done, not so much on what it's done with. So feel free to learn from this one what you can, because there's a lot to learn. And this style can actually look really, really beautiful done right. And it's like a hallmark to a lot of different styles, and you may notice it out and about a little bit, but I'm going to show you kind of a beginner's guide into how to make it. So I'm just adding in a little bit more details here while I talk, because I want to really show this off. So take this thing as as what you'll end up seeing in the end. Or what you'll end up seeing before you refine it. Now, the refining step on this takes a lot of time. This is the big drawback to this style, because if you don't take the time for this refining, then it'll just look bad, or it'll look really unfinished. Now, what you want to do is any of these little points like this, like where two lines converge, you want to make that thicker. And it's not a very big deal. It really isn't. In fact, to kind of make my point, I'm going to do this on a different layer, and I'll show you the before and after. But it doesn't look like a huge deal to do this. And you can go back up and you can kind of add little marks like this because you can, and because you're refining this. But you basically want to spend all of your time making these lines uniform and making the areas where they intersect blend in together. Areas like this, where this jaw is underneath, so it's actually underneath here, and it would probably jump up like that. This would actually bend around on itself. Since it's behind, that kind of creates a hint of a shadow. Now, jumping back here, since this is a very dramatic area where stuff will suddenly change, then only the bottom will have this line to it. You don't do it on the top, because suddenly it'll jump up, and this neck is completely on the underside of the neck. So the neck is on the underside of the neck. The line work is only on the underside of the head. So this will help push that in the back a little bit. For things like this, and for the hair as well, if you ever have these spots like this, where it's just a single line going out, you put a dot at the bottom and drag that out just a little bit. You want the base to actually be longer than the end, because that'll end up making these both feel like they have a little bit of a wider, or a smaller base at the bottom, and then it suddenly gets a little bit wider. And that'll look pretty nice in the end. And then, obviously, these 2 points intersect, so you'll make them a little bit thicker. Maybe bring it back a little bit. And notice I'm doing this with the same tool that I made the rest of the lines with, because it's really just you going back over the same thing. You're remaking those same lines, just a little bit wider. And not wide enough to warrant a whole new tool for it. It's just the same thing. And the way you do this traditionally is, well, you just go back over your lines. Any spot where you see a little intersection, and like you'll probably be seeing it at this size, you just kind of hit and drag and just kind of pull those back out again. And you can actually make those lines again. This doesn't require you to be, this close and just like super, super fine details and bring that back out. Just have this line you can be this far out. You can be this far out, and it'll be perfectly fine. You can manage that effect very well. Now, for items of importance, you want to have just thicker lines. You don't really want to have that little slope of a gradient going into them. For the bridge of the glasses here, I will, because the bridge of the glasses will look nice with it. But the glasses themselves are actually pretty uniform in size compared to what I'm doing elsewhere, like in the mouth and down here. You really don't want to care about what's on the outside for this. Like, this is the background and such. Nope. The line doesn't care what's on the outside. In fact, this being as thick as it is, totally worthless. I'm probably going to end up erasing that later and redrawing it because I don't like how that looks. So I'm going to throw this into a bit of a time lapse and do all the line works at once. And I'll throw down the basic colors as well, purely because I think that will help point out the differences between these. Even though they're all the same line work, you'll be able to see exactly how similar they are and how different they can make everything feel. See you real soon. And welcome back. So as you see, I refined all the line works a little bit, cleaned up a couple of things here and there, and then I went through and colored it all. So you can kind of see how they're all the same thing. It's just the same character with the same glasses, with the same expression, looking in the same direction, roughly. Some of the eyes got a little bit funky. And the only thing that's changed majorly between all of these was the lines. And you can see that it made a huge difference in how they're all perceived. This one down here on the bottom, you could see being part of like a webcomic or something, because the outlines seem very, very simple to do. Yet I could still get all these details inside, like the glasses and with the eyes, without having these super thick things going on. The thin lines up here, you can see that it's like it's much more expressive, and it feels a little bit more ad hoc than the rest of them, but it still works out really well. The uniform lines is simple and easy to understand, and then the thin and expressive is very, very subtle with how it works, but it adds a lot to it. It gives it a lot more life. Now, as I said before, I was going to do all this on different layers so you can see the difference. So if we zoom in down here, that's it without anything. And this is it with it. It doesn't add a lot. It really doesn't. But those tiny little differences makes it feel a lot better of an image. Now, you might be saying like, oh, he has all these different line works, but he like just showed us. No, I use all of these constantly and in different things. Here, let me show you. I'll put these things up on the screen. But for the uniform line style, I use that thing for much faster by comparison items. Things like chibis are the perfect example. I'm doing a lot of chibis recently, and all those use the uniform line style. With thin lines, you can get a really, really comic book feel, like this thing right here. Like, I actually went through and I did shading with the lines as well, because I wanted it to feel as though I took a sketchbook page out and colored it digitally. That thing was completely done digitally. There was no traditional steps in it, but I wanted to make that feel. With the comic book style, the image here, I wanted to get a very, very action-y feel, and I felt as though like a graphic novel thing would have worked really well. The coloring is very experimental. I did a marker shade style using the marker tool in Sai, so ignore that. But if you notice the really, really thick outlines, I made them much smaller for the tail and for the back foot compared to the hand in the front, which is much, much thicker, purely because those worked really, really well being put into perspective. It's a very action-y scene, and the comic, like the super comic-y outlines worked very well for it. With the thin and expressive, it's very, very subtle. Like, you really won't know I've done that unless you actually really pay attention or you're there watching me see it. So here's the most recent speed art I've done, and I use the thin and expressive styles for that. Almost that entire thing is done like very, very thin lines, like practically 2 pixels thick. And then I went through and I like brought out all of those borders, and I made the whole thing like feel much more interesting without having the lines take over the overall drawing. And that's a very, very strong use of thin and expressive lines. So now we're back to this. This is only 4 different styles. Now, I love line work. Like, I feel as though a drawing should be able to stand on its own with its line work. Now, that's not to say it can't be improved with colors, and it can't be improved with shading, and it can't be improved with other things. But if it can't stand alone with its line work, then I feel as though it's a great opportunity missed by the artist. Now, this is not a jab at anybody who does a very particular line work style. I'm just absolutely insane, and I want to learn all the different line works that there is out there. And I know a lot more than just these 4. I just thought 4 would be a good starting point for a tutorial on these. So if you're interested in seeing more of these things later, let me know. Like, put a comment down below, note me on any website I use. That's all linked down in the bottom. So just contact me. I have my email is linked down the bottom. You can't get more direct than emailing me. And if I get like enough interest with this, I'll throw up another 4 different styles, or maybe 3 styles. It depends on how much I really want to show you at the time. This is only 4, and these 4 are relatively like similar to each other in the end. So now that I've plugged my other drawings, even my speed art series, I'm gonna end the video here. Thank you all for watching, and as always, have a wonderful day. Goodbye.